Another new law deals with our trash, more specifically our food scraps or leftovers.
It's a way to make sure the things we waste don't go to waste.
Yes, a state law that will soon go into effect says you can no longer scrape leftover food scraps directly into your trash can.
Composting became a requirement across California on January 1st. Why? To curb methane emissions. This law was signed in 2016 by then Governor Jerry Brown. You may know it as the short-lived Climate Pollutant Reduction Law, or by its more formal name, SB 1383. And the law enforces two things. The first is an edible food diversion goal. Grocery stores and restaurants can't just toss edible food in the garbage. 20% of it has to go to Californians who need it by 2025. But the second part, that's what we're focusing on in this video. Everyone in California is now required to compost. And not just your food scraps, your yard trimmings and your used pizza boxes, they've got to go in the green bin as well. And both these requirements have one common goal: diverting organic waste from landfills.
So what happens when you dispose of organic waste in a landfill is, if you can imagine, the waste goes from your house, it's picked up, it's dropped off in the landfill. The landfill ultimately, is more and more waste is put in it and it gets covered.
That's Ned Spang. He's an associate professor in the Department of Food Science and Technology at UC Davis, and his work focuses on the intersection of food and the environment, which means he spends a lot of time examining food loss and waste.
And what happens there is that there's a lack of oxygen being mixed around with the material that's put in the landfill. When there's no oxygen available, the microbial community that takes over in that kind of environment actually breaks down organic material and releases methane. And methane is actually a potent greenhouse gas.
That's what SB 1383 is trying to tackle.
So when that is released to the environment, it contributes to global warming. And to put it into context, it's about 25 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So what we're trying to do is avoid that outcome and divert organic waste from landfill so that we can put it along pathways that reduce the amount of methane that's emitted to the atmosphere.
In other words, keeping organic waste from going into landfills equals less methane emitted into the atmosphere in the long run. The California Air Resources Board maintains what's called the Greenhouse Gas Inventory. It's a big database that keeps track of greenhouse gas emissions across the state. And here we've got the inventory for methane emissions across various sectors in 2019. Take this number and divide it by this number, and we see that landfills are responsible for about 1/5 of the state's methane emissions that year. These estimates are calculated through what's called a first-order decay model, and it takes into account variables like how long organisms take to break down organic matter and how much organic waste there is in landfills. According to CalRecycle, it's the state agency in charge of keeping SB 1383 on track. Organic waste makes up at least half of what we dump in landfills. SB 1383 sets targets by which California has to divert organic waste from landfills. These targets are based on the 2014 benchmark of 23 million tons of disposed organic waste. By 2020, California was supposed to divert 50% of organic waste from that 2014 baseline. And by 2025, we're supposed to divert 75% from 2014 levels. I asked CalRecycle if we had met that 2020 goal, and representatives said no. They estimate the amount of organics going to landfills actually increased slightly over that 2014 benchmark. Diverting organic waste from landfills is the first step. Next comes processing it all. I'm at Recology's composting facility in Vernalis, around 70 miles away from San Francisco. 1,500 tons of organic waste is delivered here every day, including what's generated by Mountain View's businesses. I'm here to see how Recology takes all of this stuff and turns it into this. That's Robert Reed. He's Recology's public relations manager. He spent a morning showing me around the facility. After trucks deliver the waste, it goes through a sorting system to catch any inorganic materials that have made it into the mix. Once that's done, the composting process starts. Waste is piled up, and then throughout the decomposition process, the piles are kept moist and workers ensure they are aerated. It typically takes 60 days for the compost to be ready. It's then sold for $5 to $10 per ton and trucked off. Recology is able to add soil amendments to create unique blends for clients based on their needs, and that costs more. Recology runs 5 of these facilities in California, and in March of this year, CalRecycle told me there were a total of 160 composting facilities across the state. And there's an additional 16 anaerobic digestion facilities and 23 biomass operations. both of which can also process organic waste. But these 199 facilities are not going to be enough to process the estimated 18 million tons of organic waste that California wants diverted from landfills by 2025. We're going to need to build more. CalRecycle said it's expecting the state to have about 10 million tons of new processing capacity by 2025, but that still leaves 8 million tons of nowhere to go. In August, cities and counties across the state will submit capacity reports to CalRecycle. In other words, communities have to figure out how much organic waste they're generating, and then they have to figure out where that waste is going to be processed. And if they don't have enough capacity to process all the organic waste, they'll need to provide plans for funding the necessary infrastructure by the end of this year.
It's soft, it's warm, and it's a sponge. It's a natural sponge, good quality compost. It's 50% humus by weight, so it attracts and retains water. This is very important for regions that are hit by higher temperatures and drought.
Humus is a component of soil that comes from decomposed organic material. It contains important nutrients like nitrogen. And Robert is touching on something important here. Composting isn't only going to reduce the amount of methane we're emitting, it's also keeping moisture in the ground. This is Frank Oligari, and we're on his farm Blossom Vineyards. I met with him back in February when he agreed to show me how compost and ground cover work together to keep soil moist.
Your most productive soil is your top layer, so you keep that moist.
The compost under this mulch was put down in fall 2021, and in February, that's a couple months later, the ground was still wet to the touch. Over here, we're looking at soil that did not receive any compost. The ground is super hard, dry, and cracked. California soil can't benefit from compost if we don't start separating our food scraps and soiled papers from the rest of our trash. And right now, it's mostly up to cities and counties to get us to change our behavior. But the state is going to start finding jurisdictions that are not complying with SB 1383, up to $10,000 per violation per day. And by 2024, jurisdictions need to start imposing penalties on residential and commercial clients that aren't complying with the law. CalRecycle told me this law is the biggest change to trash in California since we started recycling in the 1980s. And it's the easiest way for Californians to fight climate change. But there's some nuance to this. Composting isn't just going to stop methane emissions from landfills overnight. It's not a light switch that we can turn on and off. There's currently a ton of organic waste in landfills that has yet to break down into methane. In this chart, the California Air Resources Board estimates how much more degradable carbon there is in landfills. And here, we see the estimated level of methane emissions happening at the same time. Even with Californians following SB 1383, there isn't going to be a sudden dip in emissions in the near future, because there's still all this organic waste that is going to decompose and create methane. But if we're consistent with diverting our food scraps and our yard trimmings and our soiled papers, both these lines will trend down over time. As individuals, it can often feel that trying to improve the climate crisis involves drastic changes in our lives. Doing things like installing solar panels or investing in an electric vehicle or appliances isn't possible for a lot of folks. But taking the time to sort what goes in our trash, that's a more accessible solution. Diverting organic waste from landfills is one way we can collectively work to reduce planet-warming methane emissions in California.